my German boss told me that I had to be harder. I had to be more forceful. I had to really push things through. But I had to say I resisted. It wasn't the American way. Hello and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. I'm John Stech, your host on this journey. We travel the globe to bring you stories about culture and the global automotive industry. Fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. Welcome to part 2 of episode 12. Today we finish the conversation on the failure of the DaimlerChrysler merger. In case you missed part 1, I would suggest going back, listening to that one prior to starting this episode. So I received an offer to move to DaimlerChrysler's headquarters in Auburn Hills, Michigan, and to take on this role of being the head of volume planning and sales planning and sales reporting for about 120 different countries that were outside of the NAFTA region. I thought this was really exciting. I had always seen that there would be a huge opportunity to work on both sides of the DaimlerChrysler family, so I jumped on it. I would pack up my bags. I would move my family in October of 2002 out to Michigan, and I would be working on the 9th floor at Chrysler International in the world headquarters of Chrysler, which at that time was the second largest office building on the planet, second only to the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. Very exciting. Now, without getting into too much detail about the vast differences between Mercedes-Benz and Chrysler volume planning, I can tell you I had a challenge ahead of me. The thinking process that went into the volume planning and the philosophy in the way that the factories worked and even just the demand for the product was vastly different. And let me just sum it up in a nutshell. So the Chrysler methodology was based on a backwards looking, historically looking, sales-based algorithm that would then calculate how much production is needed to fuel the sales going forwards. And it was adjusting for seasonality and so on and so forth in this model, in this algorithm. It was always assumed that manufacturing can build as many cars as sales would ever need, because in the past, for the most part, that was in fact true. There would always be more production capacity in the U.S. factories, the Canadian and the Mexican factories, than the markets could swallow. The Mercedes-Benz planning system was based on a completely different set of principles. And since 1995, 1996 timeframe, Mercedes had continuously been introducing new product to its portfolio. You had the new E-Class in 1994. Not long after, you had an SLK being added. You had an A-Class being added. You had the M-Class being added. So all of these new products, the CLK, model after model after model was being added to the product lineup. And oftentimes at the beginning of the launch and even deep into the life cycle of the product, they couldn't build enough cars for the demand of the customer. So the factory was always a little bit behind. Of course, there were exceptions to that. And there were some cars that had to be pushed a little bit on the market, not that were not in as much high demand. Now, the way that the Mercedes-Benz system worked was it was based on production, right? You were limited by the amount of cars that you could sell. So you would have a sales forecast, how many you could sell. You would ask the factory for a production allocation. The factory would tell you yes or no, we can build it, we can't build it. And then you would have a sales forecast submitted to the headquarters that was either constrained by the production, so you could sell more if you had more, or you were selling the maximum amount possible based on market demand because the production was available. So very, very different philosophical differences in the planning. So why would somebody want to bring me, who was steeped in this Mercedes-Benz methodology, out to Auburn Hills? Well, Chrysler stood at the threshold of a completely new era at that point in time. Up until now, about 90% of the product was sold in the US, Canada, and Mexico. And about 10% was exported and sold in other markets around the world. Now, under the new DaimlerChrysler regime, This was supposed to change. There was supposed to be a big product offensive with all sorts of models that were more tuned towards international markets. They would add diesel engines, they would add right-hand drives, they would add smaller cars into the mix that would be more attractive to people in countries located in Europe or in Asia or other parts of the planet. This product offensive would result in a lot of complexity at the factory, right? With all of those different variants that I just mentioned. And so as a result of that, it was assumed that the manufacturing would have some degree of difficulty in ramping up with all of the manufacturing uh, complexity of the different variants, and that there would be constraints, that there would be more demand than the factory would be able to produce. And this would put Chrysler very much into the same situation that Mercedes had had for the past roughly decade. The assumption was not bad. It was a good assumption to take, but it also meant that the entire planning system at Chrysler, especially for the small markets around the world, had to be turned on its head, and a completely different philosophy had to be implemented. And that was my job. I was supposed to come in there and change that philosophy, to plan differently in these 120 countries, and to then bring in and introduce that same web-based planning system from Mercedes-Benz that I had just implemented at Mercedes-Benz USA. Now I was supposed to do that for those 120 countries around the world. This would not be an easy task for a couple of different reasons. Number one was trust. I came from Mercedes-Benz. I was German American. Do they trust me? And there was always that question of trust between the American side and German side in the family. And the question was whether I was just going to be another person coming in and telling them what to do at Chrysler, that I knew all the answers and that they didn't. That was a question. How do I overcome that? And I had to overcome this potential for lack of trust by building it, by showing that I really truly wanted Chrysler to be successful. I wanted Chrysler, to make it in the future, and to show my loyalty and my enthusiasm for the Jeep and the Chrysler and the Dodge brands, as well as to really teach the team about why the company works differently at Mercedes-Benz versus Chrysler, just to bridge the gap, to take a little bit of that, unknown out of the equation. Some of the team that I worked with, they had been there for over 40 years at the company, having vast experience that I could never possibly match up to. And so, it was daunting to me to work with them and to try to explain how we probably have to do things a little bit different than they had experienced in the past over their 40-year career. For me, this was a daunting task. I respected them and their experience very much. But at the same time, I also had to, at the same in that same action, move forward and implement new processes and implement new ways of thinking, new ways of doing things. I spent countless time, so many hours during and after working hours, to explain and demystify the Mercedes-Benz way of planning and the philosophy and the way of thinking. I didn't say, I made sure of it, I did not say that it was a better way. It's just a different way. And Chrysler was going to be coming into an era where that different way probably matches up more to what Chrysler had to do than in the past. I answered questions. I illustrated with lots of examples, kind of doing some compare and contrast. And I showed some printouts from the Mercedes-Benz USA system, just to kind of demystify, what am I talking about? How does it work? What are some of the strengths? And how could we make those adaptations between the Mercedes-Benz system and the Chrysler system? The company functioned differently, so you couldn't just overlay the one on the other. There had to be actually some adaptation, because the overall company had different workflows and assumptions built into the structure of the company. But again, a lot of it was the human element. I had to really display my loyalty and my willingness to make Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge a success, especially on this, this global push with the product offensive. As much as possible, I tried to avoid making direct comparisons between Mercedes and Chrysler. Be honest. I think all of you have had that new employee that's come in from another company, and every 5 minutes they make a comparison to their old company, and after a while it gets old, right? And I know that, and you know that. So it was, it was challenging for me to give examples and to walk through and illustrate things without making that direct comparison, making them feel, my team feel that, Mercedes-Benz knew how to do it right and everything Chrysler did was wrong. That was absolutely not the case. It was just a time for change. This was extremely stressful. Again, as I mentioned before, the international markets for which we were responsible only had about 10% of the sales of the corporation. So it was a very, very small part. So in some way, the tail was wagging the dog. We asked the larger markets to adapt to something different, when in fact the smaller markets were the ones that were kind of suffering under the old planning system and planning methodology. One of the issues that came up was just the way that orders were placed, right? There would be a production plan, which cars would be produced all the way down to the trim levels. And the issue was that the orders would come in from Canada and Mexico and US, and they would not match up to the orders, or excuse me, the production plan of trim level mix. And as a result, the factory would, at the last moment, try to adjust their production plan to the incoming orders. And that resulted in millions of parts, millions of dollars of parts being scrapped every month, just as a result of this mismatch between the orders and the production. Well, that was the tail wagging the dog, because it was killing the international production plan. As they were swinging around the production for NAFTA, a lot of times it simply meant that we, the international markets, didn't get our cars. They were simply lost somehow in this big changing around of the production program. So the overall system needed more, let's say, discipline, and a little bit more, let's say, foresight ahead of time, better planning and better forecasting, in order for this entire thing to work, so that all countries around the globe would be satisfied with their production allocations, and nobody would be starved for product, and that no parts would be scrapped on the order that they were being scrapped in the past. As I had embarked on this journey of change, really pushing not only for the change amongst the 120 countries that I was responsible for, but ultimately also being a little bit the instigator for change for the large markets, it was stressful. It was a stressful time. My boss, my German boss, told me that I had to be harder. I had to be more forceful. I had to really push things through. But I had to say I resisted. I resisted this order to do this. It wasn't the American way. It might work once to tell somebody what to do in a top-down way, but after a while, people don't listen to you anymore. And I needed, in order to implement this massive sea change, I needed to have cooperation. Why? Because I didn't want people to comply only once. I needed the entire team and the entire system to work every single month with every monthly submission of the plan. So I couldn't come in like a freight train. I had to come in, as people have said, with a velvet hammer. I have to say, after a year, I had another conversation with my boss, and he told me that, okay, my approach did in fact work, and I could continue, in his eyes, to use this more American style approach, which was to come to a bit more of a a cooperative, conclusion and cooperation with the team, rather than just coming in heavy fisted and demanding things change for our countries. In the end, it was a difficult transition on the U.S., Mexico, Canadian side, together with us. But I have to admit, I still have contact with a few people that lived through that process with me, and we still both grimace and smile at the cooperation that we had throughout that episode. So there we were. We were waiting for this product offensive to start, and we were ready with the production planning, with all of the planning systems. The product management for the international markets was strategizing along the way, but something was not right. There were certainly shortcomings in this product offensive, in the product planning and the product strategy. So because I was responsible for volume planning, not only in the current time frame, but also 3 years out, I sat in a lot of strategic product planning meetings so that I could understand what was in the pipeline and how do we start to plan those products into the volume plan, and how do we work with the different countries to get their forecasts for those different products into our 3-year forecast. And by participating in all these conversations, I could see the challenge between the Mercedes-Benz and the Chrysler side of the business. I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the podcast that I didn't think that the ultimate failure of Daimler Chrysler was cultural. I don't think so. I think a lot of it hinged on this whole concept of synergies and savings and efficiencies. And I think here in the product, that's where it fell short. So during the entire 9 years of Daimler Chrysler, the product and the technology sharing and the platform sharing was incredibly scant. It didn't happen. Essentially, the head of the Mercedes-Benz brand at that time, he forbade the use of any new or current technology currently in Mercedes-Benz products to also find its way into Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge products. If anything, Chrysler was supposed to get essentially yesterday's technology. As a result, here's one example. Mercedes-Benz launched a brand new R171 SLK. It was the second generation of that particular model. Well, only at that point in time could Chrysler have the R170 previous generation platform and do something with that platform. The result was the Chrysler Crossfire, a pretty cool, I have to say, 2-seat vehicle that once you got inside, you immediately saw that this was a derivative from the Mercedes SLK, but very fun to drive little product. Again, it was yesterday's technology because it wasn't allowed to overlap with the current generation SLK. You had the Chrysler 300, the Dodge Charger, the Dodge Challenger. You had the original 2003 Chrysler Pacifica. And all of those had a variety of W210 E-Class suspension components, like a handful of components. But that particular product, the W210 E-Class, it started in 1994 and it ended in 2003. So essentially, when all of those new Chrysler products came onto the market, again, they had yesterday's Mercedes-Benz component integrated into them. So even the Challengers and the Chargers, which were produced as recently as 2024, they can trace still to that time some of their components back to 1994 of the original W210 E-Class. And then there were the two products that I had been deeply involved with at the beginning of the merger, the M-Class and the Jeep Grand Cherokee. Those vehicles only shared a platform very late, very late. In fact, by the time the new Grand Cherokee launched in 2010 and the next generation M-Class launched in 2011, the merger was already finished. It was done. It had failed. but somehow the two companies still shared that platform after, well, after the merger had been dissolved, and both frankly went on to become quite successful products in their own right using the same platform. Again, too little, too late. There weren't really savings, there weren't really synergies, and the parts bins were kept pretty much separated by a fence. So the savings, the synergies, the opportunities that were touted as a reason for the merger, they didn't occur. They didn't happen. Nothing materialized. So as a result, the merger was not in a good path. It wasn't giving the results that it needed. And worst of all, from a shareholder perspective, a huge amount of the shareholder value had evaporated in the stock. The shareholders simply didn't have confidence that this thing would work. Because of that, Jürgen Schremp was out. He left in 2005, and he was replaced by Dr. Dieter Zetsche. Zetsche had been beloved in Auburn Hills. He had been for a little over 5 years. He was the CEO of the Chrysler side of the family, guiding this company, through its resurgence, through the product offensive, and now he would rise to be the CEO of the global corporation. There were certainly some hopes that things would change in Stuttgart in 2005, 2006 as a result of Dieter Zetsche ascending to this global CEO role. Unfortunately, people would be disappointed rather than excited by the result. In episode 11 of the Auto Ethnographer podcast, I talked about my experience of moving to Egypt and running the DaimlerChrysler operation there as managing director, responsible for both the Mercedes-Benz side and the Chrysler side of the family. As I mentioned, my primary responsibility and mission was to smooth out some of the frictions that were happening between the two sides of the house. Certainly the sales and marketing, they were separated because the brands have their own identities, and those units could work separately. But some of the back office area, the human resources, the finance, legal, customer service, some of those areas did work together, supporting both sides of the house. And there was friction. It didn't always work in cooperation with either side, the Chrysler side or the Mercedes-Benz side. So my mission was to figure out how to get some harmony and better efficiency and more success, better sales, and higher profitability in the market by getting a more harmonious and more efficiently functioning national sales company. Just as a note, Egypt was, I think at that time, the only sales company in any country that started as a Chrysler company and absorbed Mercedes-Benz into it. Everywhere else on the planet, whether it was in Japan or in Germany or France or anywhere, it generally started out as a Mercedes-Benz company, which then absorbed or started a Chrysler side of the business. But ultimately, it was a Mercedes-Benz company, and Mercedes-Benz was typically the highest focus of those sales companies around the globe. In this case, there had been my predecessor, someone who had come from Chrysler, a lifelong Chrysler manager, with more focus on Chrysler. And that was the reason for my being installed, was to put some more focus on Mercedes-Benz and help that brand grow, especially as it was about to launch a locally produced version of the S-Class, the first time that the S-Class would ever be produced outside of Sindelfingen in Germany. So I spent months trying to get this harmony, trying to bring everyone together to work together in a more cooperative way between the brands in the front office and the back office of the company. And then the big announcement hit. Ironically, it was on Valentine's Day, February 14th of 2007, when Dieter Zetsche, whom I just mentioned as the former CEO on the Chrysler side of the family, he announced that, quote, all options were on the table for Chrysler, unquote. What did that mean? It basically meant that he put a for sale sign on the roof of the Chrysler building in Auburn Hills. And this would have a lot of repercussions for me personally in my role managing both sides of the house in Egypt. Exactly 3 months later, after this all options are on the table announcement, it was announced on May 14th that Chrysler was being sold to Cerberus Capital Management. Now, Dr. Zetsche, as a result of this, went from being beloved in Auburn Hills to being reviled. He sold out the company. He, pushed them out and sold them off, and essentially took a lot of the good stuff with him with Mercedes-Benz. So, for example, there was a factory that Chrysler had been operating since the early 1980s, one of the first foreign factories in China, in Beijing. Daimler took that. R&D, the real basic R&D, had been closed at Chrysler and effectively moved over to Stuttgart and handled by the Mercedes-Benz side of the family. So as a result, Chrysler didn't have any truly, innovative R&D immediately at the time of the separation. And there were other examples of things that Daimler kind of picked and choose different parts and bits and kept those, and then left and sold the rest to Cerberus Capital Management. This announcement of the sale, as you can imagine, this completely blew up all of my efforts for the past half year of trying to build harmony inside of DaimlerChrysler Egypt. You can imagine that now that they were going to separate, that there was no reason for anyone to cooperate with anybody between the two sides of the house. And I indeed had to remain there for the next 7 months till roughly the end of the year before I would move on to my next assignment. And it became increasingly challenging to get cooperation between all of the different departments in the company, as they knew that they would be moving off into separate and distinct futures in the coming months. Now, they were still owned, the entire entity was still owned by Daimler, so they really called the shots. It was not until later that a Chrysler Egypt would be formed that Chrysler could take its own decisions. But for now, the two lived uncomfortably under one roof. As I left, I had to be replaced not only by one successor, but I had two. I had a Mercedes-Benz successor and I had a Chrysler successor. And even though those two individuals knew each other and liked each other personally, there were political forces coming from Stuttgart which forced the Mercedes-Benz side to really make life somewhat uncomfortable for the Chrysler side, really pushing them out as fast as possible from the company, finding their office, moving to another place. Things that included, for example, turning off door ID cards so that people couldn't enter and leave the office so easily. So little things like this. But that was indicative of, let's say, a little bit of a spiteful divorce. And this would be, the scene around the world as Daimler, as I mentioned before, owned all of the sales companies and then ejected Chrysler from them to go and form their own sales companies country by country by country. So again, rather uncomfortable situation, but something that had to be navigated by me, for example, between the Americans, the Germans, and also the Egyptians locally. Shortly after the announcement that the company was separating, I was asked, which side do I want to land on? I had spent years on the Mercedes-Benz side. I had spent years on the Chrysler side, more or less half and half. Where do I want to go with the divorce? Which parent do I want to go live with in the future? I opted staying with the Chrysler side, as I had indicated in episode 11. After the sale to Cerberus, the international operations would desperately need people who understood how to work in an international environment. and how to translate that back to the global headquarters. And one by one, as the offices were being evicted from Mercedes-Benz offices, a decision had to be taken. Over my 9 years within this construct of Daimler Chrysler, I always had my eyes open, and I always watched these cultural interactions between the two sides. And I just want to come back to the first thought that I had on the podcast. Was this a purely cultural failure between the Germans and the Americans, or was it something different? Again, I would say no. No, it was not pure. Yes, there were frictions. Yes, there were issues between the way that the two sides worked within the company, but those can be overcome. Those can be overcome regardless of how frustrating they may be. Those are things that can be overcome. Americans have worked at German companies for decades in the United States, and it's successful and it's harmonious, and they've learned how to adapt. It's happened for decades. Americans have worked at German companies. Germans have worked at American companies in Germany and have been successful because they learn how the other side does business and they adapt themselves to it. They learn how to communicate effectively. They learn how to negotiate effectively. They learn how to make business decisions together effectively. However, this situation was a bit different. It's not an American going to work in a German company, to find a job. This was a long-standing, proud American company, which had overnight turned half German, with the kind of dominating half being the German side. There was resistance at Chrysler. There was resistance to change. And there was even, of course, resentment at being perceived as existing as the junior partner in the relationship. There was resistance to change. There was resistance to doing things a new way. And frankly, in Stuttgart, there was also very little effort actually made to understand how the American half of the company worked. There was no adaptation. With MBUSA, Stuttgart can more or less tell them what to do. There would be pushback from the American team there. But at the end of the day, they could force the local team to do what they wanted. But this was different with Chrysler, because it was a large, iconic American company that was resistant to change, and without meeting halfway on either side. Certainly there was some issue with regards to the expectation of success. But in my opinion, that cultural clash, which certainly there was some, was not the ultimate deal breaker. The ultimate deal breaker goes right down to money talks. Money talks, and when the share price plummeted throughout those 9 years, the shareholders, they revolted. They were upset. They would stand up at the annual shareholder meeting in Stuttgart, and they were able to speak directly to the executive team, with an open mic portion of the meeting, and they made their dissatisfaction very well known. No, the real problem was that the efficiencies, the synergies, and all of the savings were evasive. They never happened. They never occurred. Ultimately, it was the fact that there was a brick wall set up between the two brands with respect to the product, with respect to the innovation flowing amongst all the brands, the ability to share components was simply not there. Helmut Gorsa on episode 3 spoke about air conditioning units and how they had spent hours and days talking about how it was not possible to use a Jeep air conditioner unit in a Mercedes, nor a Mercedes air conditioner unit in a Jeep, even if the customers never see what this box behind the dashboard actually looks like. But none of that ever came to pass. A lot of it was blocked, by philosophy of this, let's say, brand separation, which then also flowed into 100% product separation. So that's my take on the 9 years of Daimler Chrysler. Those are my experiences. It's my opinions. I'm really sure that other people will have different opinions from this, and I would love to hear them. You can go to the website, www.auto-ethnographer.com, and leave your opinion there. Send it in to me. You can go on YouTube, write the comment directly below the video, and let me know what you think. Or you can also go on some of the social media like LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram and let me know what you think about my opinion about Daimler Chrysler. It was not a cultural failure, a little bit, yes, but primarily it was a failure based on lack of cooperation, lack of sharing, driven essentially by one office in Stuttgart. I thank you for listening this week. I hope it was interesting. This was a very long journey, 9 years of my life and countless of other people who were part of this long journey. Hopeful at the beginning, not as hopeful at the very end when the thing fell apart. But I look forward to having additional conversations about this in the future. That's it for this week's episode. Again, please send me your comments. Send me your agreement or disagreement on whether you think I'm right or wrong about this assessment. And I look forward to having a dialogue. I might even have to take some of those comments and disagreements and make a mini episode just to share some of the feedback that I've received. Until next week, keep on driving. Thank you for joining us on today's journey. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Auto Ethnographer and leave us a rating or comment. For more information, visit our website at auto-ethnographer.com. You can also follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.